Welcome to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast, brought to you by the Sales Enablement Collective. Each episode, we sit down with sales enablement and revenue leaders from around the world and invite them to share their expertise and experience with the community. On this episode, we spoke to Lisa Duncan, Senior Director of Revenue Enablement at Meltwater, about everything sales kickoff, from planning to themes and everything in between. I hope you enjoy our conversation. On the show today is Lisa Duncan. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So before we sort of jump into things, could you introduce yourself for our listeners, give a bit of background on your enablement career to this point, what you're doing now, and what you've gotten up to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I lead the enablement team at Meltwater. We're a global social, consumer, and media intelligence company. We have about 27,000 customers around the world. And I've been with the company for almost a year. Prior to Meltwater, I was at SurveyMonkey for 5 years. I was scaling and leading the enablement team, in both cases responsible for pre and post sales enablement. And before SurveyMonkey, I was at Google for 12 and a half years. I spent 10 years in sales. And then my first shift over into enablement was at YouTube, where I was doing a lot of sales comms, sales plays, sales activation. So been about 9 years now that I've been in enablement.
Nice. Really great background as well. The sort of expertise that we want to bring onto the podcast, which is really nice. So our topic for today is sales kickoff. And before we sort of fully get into it, how do you feel about SKO? Do you sort of look forward to it? Do you get nervous when it's around the corner? It's a bit of a tricky one for some people sometimes. How do you feel about SKO?
I really love SKO. It's so overwhelming and exhausting and nerve-wracking, but I also find it just really exciting and exhilarating and gratifying. And if you've got a good team that you're working with, it can be a lot of fun. So I love it. It's one of the things I look forward to every year. And I just get ready for a few months of really intensive work in order to put on an amazing event for our sales team. And luckily I've had a good team around me with every sales kickoff I've done. And so I've always just felt really happy afterwards with what we've been able to put on.
I really like that. I like the positive spin on it. And it's super timely as well to have this conversation. People starting to think about planning now. We're coming into sort of October time as well. I want to bring it back to sort of the very first SKO you did. What did that process look like? And how did you sort of feel in the moment when it was your first time doing it? And maybe you didn't have the experience that you've built up now.
So my first full-fledged kickoff was at SurveyMonkey. And it was a little crazy because I started at the company at the end of October, which is prime kickoff planning season. And I actually did the same thing at Meltwater. I started and immediately had to go into planning kickoff. At SurveyMonkey, when I joined, we hadn't even signed the contract yet with the vendor. So I joined at the end of October. Mid-November, we signed the contract with the hotel. And 8 weeks later, we put on the event. So it was pretty crazy to do it that quickly, especially being new to the company. I didn't know anybody there. I didn't know how to get things done. I just knew we had to move really fast. And so I just tried to very quickly get alignment with the sales leadership team on what we wanted to accomplish, get a theme together quickly around that, build the agenda. And again, not knowing anybody or how to do things, I just knew we had to move really fast. And for me, it was a really nice opportunity to get to know our leadership team as I was helping them prepare for their presentations and just find people around the company who wanted to help. Because I've found with Kickoff, it's such a high profile event. A lot of people want to be part of it. They want to contribute to it. And in that case, I just took every idea that came my way, even some of the crazy ones, because that was really the only way for me to get it done, was put my project management skills to good use, coach our speakers really well, and take all the help I could get. And we managed to pull it off, and it was great.
I really like that. That's impressive. I was kicking off your career there as well as sort of doing the sales kickoff, which is nice. And so years later now, you've got a lot more experience with them. Do you have a sort of SKO process that you follow? What does that look like? I'm thinking for our listeners who maybe are in that planning phase or want sort of steps or a framework to follow. Do you have something like that?
I do. And I was thinking about that when I was working on the Meltwater kickoff, how grateful I was to have that, because for me, it's become a bit rinse and repeat, which makes it really helpful to execute. For me, it always starts with our goals and the outcomes that we want to drive with kickoff. And it's really around, if I'm thinking about our attendees, what do I want them to know, feel, be able to do differently as a result of being at kickoff? What's happening from a go-to-market perspective that we need to be able to communicate and land at kickoff? From all of that, creating a theme. And the theme is the starting point for me. So first step, goals, theme, agree with sales leadership and all of our stakeholders on that. From there, I can start to build the agenda. And the agenda for me, it always has very consistent building blocks. And this is where I say I can rinse and repeat a little bit, because we always want to hear from the CEO and the CRO, right? That's like the starting point. Maybe one does a keynote, maybe one does a fireside chat, but I start the whole agenda with them. We want to hear from product and see what they're going to be building and delivering for customers in the upcoming year. Marketing, how are they going to support the sales org? I love bringing customers to do like a customer panel or fireside chat. I love getting reps on stage to share their best practices. Sometimes we'll have like an inspiring outside speaker. So those are kind of the building blocks that I start with, and I plug them into the agenda, whether it's a half day, 2 days, like virtual, spread out over the course of a few weeks. I'm trying to manage the energy flow through all these different segments. Then I can start to pepper in like the fun and the lightweight things, maybe energizers, just to keep the energy going throughout the day. I do a very similar process with the breakout sessions. Who are we breaking out? Why? Why this group? What do they need to learn? Design the agenda similarly, and really try to make sure that in all of those we have a good diversity of speakers on the stage so that all of our reps see themselves represented in our speakers. So that gets me the agenda, and then I have to start to actually execute. So when I sit down with the speakers, I always have a briefing doc ready to go for them. It's customized to each of them, and it's explaining the theme, the goals, the audience, what we want them to talk about, how that's going to tie in with the theme and the story that we want them to tell. And that gives them a lot of guidance. And I check in with them like every 2 weeks. I'm checking in with them. Even if they haven't done anything, I give them plenty of time to develop, and I'm always reminding them so they don't forget. And it's not like a last minute thing with them. And then while they're working on their content, I'm just trying to deal with all of the little details that we have to think about in order to pull off the event, whether it's picking food or swag or starting to write the run of show. Just all these things that will pile up towards the end, I try to do early while my speakers are busy writing their content so that we can have kind of a more manageable 2-week lead up to the event.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's really nice to have a sort of run through sort of like that you mentioned. You talked about time for a second there as well. What does the sort of timeline look like? How ahead of time are you sort of starting to think about it?
Well, now I know that I can do a kickoff in 8 weeks. I don't I don't really ever want to do that again, but I know it's possible. Ideally for me, if I were to do a January kickoff, I'd be starting to think about it in August. And I'd want to be working on the goals and the theme then. And it feels early, but it gives you more breathing room, especially in Q4, where there's a lot of work to do to close business and sales leaders don't really want to be thinking about it. So ideally for me, it's like at least 3 months, 4 months. I think more realistically, it's probably 2 or 3 at the most.
That makes a lot of sense. And like you mentioned, it's SKO season. It's busy. It's overwhelming. At the start, you mentioned it's overwhelming in a good way for you. What's your advice to enablers who maybe struggle, maybe for their first one or sort of year on year, they struggle with organizing these kickoffs because of that sort of overwhelming factor, and they're struggling to get to that sort of positive side that you've reached?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the first thing I would say is take care of yourself, which it's hard to do because it's easy to just spend hours working on sales kickoff every day. And I just think it's really important to take a break, step away from the computer, do the things that fill your soul. Otherwise, you'll be waking up in the middle of the night thinking about kickoff, and you'll burn out before the event even comes. And that's not going to be any use to anybody. So that's my first piece of advice: is take care of yourself, like take breaks throughout the day. But more practically speaking, for me, I think it really comes down to 3 things. It's the goals and outcomes that we're trying to drive in the theme. That's the first piece that I think once everybody knows what the theme is, all our stakeholders are aligned to it, we can orient everything around the theme So that gets the content more cohesive. I think stakeholder management and communication is really important. So knowing who just wants to know what's happening, who wants to weigh in, and who's actually going to be doing work for you, and over communicating with all of them. I've learned the hard way that it's not good to have executives wondering what's happening with kickoff. So I like to just get ahead of it and give them updates on how we're progressing. And the last thing is just a really good project plan. I think most enablement people are good at project planning. And in this case, I think having a ton of buffer in the schedule, because things will slip and things will go wrong, and really thinking through every little detail and putting it all in the project plan. For me, no detail is too small. It's all in there. And that gives me, I think, reassurance that we're thinking through everything and we will have enough time to get it done.
That makes a lot of sense. Really appreciate that. And even with your sort of experience now and that you're sort of confident, is there still a sort of an element of kickoff that you find most challenging, or that sort of time and time again comes up, and how do you sort of work around that?
The thing I've found most challenging that comes up consistently is the fact that we're planning sales kickoffs for Q1. Um, and it's hard to get sales leader attention in Q4 when we're doing the planning because they're busy closing business, as they should be, but they also need to weigh in. They need to sign off on things. They need to help make decisions. And I would say the first couple years I was doing kickoff, it surprised me because sales kickoff was all I was thinking about. And I was like, why don't they want to meet with me about kickoff? It's so important. Surely they want it to succeed. But they knew that if they waited until after the quarter ended, it would still succeed. So for me, I know now going into it in Q4, especially November, December, I'm very unlikely to get time with sales leaders to talk about kickoff. They will give me as much time as I need after, but until then, I'm not going to get much of them. And the way I manage it now, knowing that, is just thinking about everything I can do that doesn't involve them prior to the end of the quarter. So I work with all of our non-sales speakers and I try to get all of their content done during Q4. I work on the little details of things that will pile up. Maybe they're important but not urgent in Q4, but they will become urgent like a week before kickoff. And I might as well just use the time then to do those. It's things like creating the master deck or writing the run of show, writing our comms, little things like that that just get really overwhelming if you wait. I try to manage all of that while I cannot get time with our sales leaders. The other thing I do is I put all the time I'm going to want from them on their calendars in January. So when they come back from the holidays, I have my time booked with them. They know, and I know that I'm going to have the time that I need to make decisions and get things done. And yeah, that's typically how I've managed it. And for me, it's just reassuring now knowing going into Q4 that that's going to be the case and I have a plan.
That makes a lot of sense and really good. I love putting it into the calendar ahead of time. Just get ahead of it, beat them to it. That's really good. In terms of sort of building out and then getting to the day, have you had experience as well with sort of virtual agendas and as well as in person? How do you sort of, if you're working in a virtual or even hybrid, how do you sort of balance, I guess, the in person aspect of versus a virtual? Do you find one easier? Is one more challenging? What's your sort of take on that, I guess?
Yeah, at SurveyMonkey, I mean, obviously with COVID, we pivoted to virtual and we never went back in person. So I did like 3 or 4 there that were virtual. And we really just tried to manage the energy through the agenda, knowing that people were sitting at their computers for a long time and we needed to break things up. So I think the first year we kind of crammed it all into like 2 days, but eventually we ended up spreading it out over the course of 3 weeks. So instead of having everybody spend like 2 days at their computers, we did the sales leadership kickoff one week. That was like a half day. Then the next week we did 2 half days, which was everybody. And then a week after that, we did the breakout sessions, which was also 2 half days. So we just tried to break it up a little bit so we could still get the same content in, but with less intensity of time at the computer. And we just tried to get really creative with how we could hold people's energy and keep it fun. Some of that was with the theme. I think kickoff is a time where you can get creative, you can have fun, you can be a little bit silly, and a virtual kickoff certainly you need to do that if you're going to keep the energy up. So personally, I love having people in person. When we did our Meltwater kickoff in February, just being together with everybody was amazing. And it's a very different type of energy, but I've also done enough virtual now to know that you can do it successfully if that's what you have to do, for budget reasons.
That makes a lot of sense. And do you have, you mentioned theme there, do you have a sort of favorite theme out of all the ones you've done, or is there one that's particularly stands out, or that you'd love to do again at some point?
I was thinking about that yesterday, and my favorite theme was one that we did that was related to music, and I could not for the life of me remember the tagline of it, and I'm like kicking myself for that right now. But the concept was that we were all different parts of producing a song, right? And like we're all different parts of an orchestra. We all have our role to play, but you tie it all together and it makes music, right? But we were writing our own songs, so it was kind of connecting to the teamwork, but also what each person or team could uniquely bring to the company and the magic that happens when you tie all of that together. And I think everyone just had a lot of fun with it. We had really fun visual design with the theme that just the slides popped. People could tell it was a musical theme, but it wasn't very cheesy and obvious. And then the speakers all had a lot of fun tying that in as well. They would use a lot of musical puns. They were dropping song names into just language that they were using, and people were trying to catch the music references. And I think that was one. It was virtual, but it was fun, and I think a lot of high energy, and honestly I feel like the theme contributed a lot to that.
I really like that. I think a couple of our listeners are going to be thinking of that and saying, "Oh, I'm taking that one for my one coming up." That's really great. In terms of sort of stakeholders, you mentioned earlier, like there's so many different people who get involved with that sort of all the moving parts, the parts of an orchestra, like you said as well. There's all these different people who are involved in the kickoff. How do you sort of keep everyone singing from the same hymn sheet and on the same page? Because there's so many moving parts. You mentioned with leadership, sort of blocking out time in the calendar. Do you have something similar with sort of other teams? How do you sort of pull it all together?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a bit of a broken record, but I think the theme is the start for pulling the content together at least, because I don't want kickoff ever to feel like a dog and pony show of different departments. And if all you do is go to your department head and say you have half an hour to give a presentation at kickoff, they're going to tell the sales team whatever they want to tell them, right? I try to use the theme to keep a cohesive narrative and make sure that they understand the role that they play in helping us land that message. And I'm coaching them through it. So when I'm working with our speakers, we're talking about the theme. We're looking at their slides and visually how they're connecting to the theme. We're looking at the story that they're telling and how it's going to help land the message. And I'm also sharing with them as speakers start developing their content how, if product is giving a presentation, I might tell them what customers we're bringing in and how they've been using the platform and how that can all tie back to what product is presenting. So I try to connect it all between them. And I think that helps keep their stories cohesive and connected rather than each one telling their own story. From a stakeholder management perspective, I'm also just thinking about who needs to know what in different parts of the organization. What our senior executive leadership team needs to know is very different from what maybe our sales leaders and frontline managers need to know. With the executives, it's more like, here's the story that we're telling about your team's work. Here's how much time I'm taking from your team in order to kick off, in order to develop kickoff. And, here's who's participating. Thank you for the resources. Whereas with the sales leaders, it's more like, here's what your team's going to learn, and here's what they'll need to know and do differently after kickoff and the role that you're going to play with that. So I really just try to think through all those different types of stakeholders and what they need to know about what we're doing and communicate with them often and accordingly.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to think sort of big picture and sort of in an ideal world, ideal scenario, what sort of your dream kickoff look like? Is there any sort of elements you'd love to try and do that you haven't gotten a chance to, or yeah, sort of in your dreams, what does a sort of brilliant kickoff look like?
Honestly, I feel like we did it this year with Meltwater in Las Vegas. It was everything I've always wanted to do in a kickoff and have never been able to do before. It was at an amazing venue. We were at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Vegas, which is a gorgeous hotel. We had a huge theater, and this is a kind of theater that like famous musicians perform at. Like it's a really beautiful space. The technology in the theater was next level. Like the sound, the screen was huge. It was probably 40 or 50 feet high. So we just had this beautiful space that felt very high end with amazing technology. And our designer, who was in-house, she made these amazing slides. So everything just popped on stage. It just felt like a really premium event. And then the speakers were great because we had a really strong theme for this kickoff as well. It was all oriented around our innovations in AI, how we were connecting our team and driving impact for our customers. And the speakers were really inspiring and they just landed that message. So I think from like a content and production value perspective, it was amazing. But we also just had a lot of fun. And I think the reps just loved being together in such an amazing space. And they walked out understanding what we were doing for the year, why we were rolling out what we were rolling out. They were excited about it. They were inspired. They were energized. And those are all the things I want them to feel coming out of kickoff. So that was my dream. I think we set a really high bar, and I just hope next year or whenever we do our next kickoff, we'll be able to get over it again.
That's amazing. I'm jealous that I wasn't there the way you described that. That's really great. And before we sort of wrap things up, I'm thinking again from our listeners, if there's one thing that they should take away from this conversation, they're going into planning. Maybe they've already started. They're looking to sort of fine tune things going into that sort of time of year. What's your sort of takeaway for them to make sure that they can nail it and present as good a kickoff as possible? A sort of one takeaway from the whole episode, what should it be?
Just start. Honestly, it's so easy to get overwhelmed by everything you have to do for kickoff. And I think if you don't know what to do, just do something to get yourself started. I would recommend that the something is the theme, and, then throw it all into a project plan to get yourself going. But it's very easy to just feel overwhelmed and sit at your desk with your mind spinning and not knowing what to do. And I think in that case, just do something to help you feel like you're moving forward. And the more you do that, the better you'll be able to execute.
I love that. That is really great advice. I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on and sharing that. I learned a lot, and I'm 100% sure our listeners will have as well. That was really insightful.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity. And I hope anyone listening picked up some tips to help them have an amazing kickoff.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast. Be sure to follow us on your podcast platform of choice so you don't miss a thing. And if you're hungry for more sales enablement content, visit our website, salesenablementcollective.com, for articles, events, and an easy way to join our Slack community, home to thousands of your sales enablement peers.